What's going on, everybody? Thank you for joining us on another episode of Hard Work Beats Talent, where we aim to draw upon the insights of some of the people that we admire in order to help our listeners learn from their wisdom and as well as their mistakes. My name is Nikita. I'm joined as always by my co-host and friend, Alex. We're really excited and really pleased to be able to introduce a friend of the show, an investigative, if I can say that properly, journalist, Alex. Alex, welcome to the show.
Hi.
Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. It's an honour.
It's awesome. No, we're really happy to have you. So the way we like to kick this off is to have our guests give a little bit of an introduction about themselves. So do you want to give us a bit of like an elevator pitch about yourself, who you are, what you do, and then we'll get into the nuts and bolts.
Yeah. My name is Alexandra Heal. I'm a journalist at the Financial Times. I am currently on their visual storytelling team. And before that, I was a reporter at the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, covering kind of quite niche topics. I was covering the environmental impact of the global agribusiness industry sector, and also domestic abuse by UK police officers. Okay. And then, that's kind of the gist of what I do. I guess in terms of like an elevator pitch kind of style, if I had to sum up what I'm trying to do with my career, I guess I just want to make a positive contribution to society and try and have an impact. Yeah.
Awesome. Brilliant. Thanks for sharing that.
Fantastic. And you described journalism and investigative journalism there. Can you just give our viewers a insight into the differences between the two?
Yeah. I mean, there are some people who would say that all journalism should be investigative journalism. There's something called journalism, which is just where kind of you journalists rewrite PR kind of press releases and stuff like that, and that's exactly the opposite of what like good journalism and investigative journalism is or are. General journalism can be kind of reporting on a beat, a daily beat that you have, and your job is to kind of report on what's going on in that beat. But that can be investigative too, because you are trying to find stories. You're not just telling the stories that people send you or people give you or that are already in the public domain. You're actually trying to dig up news stories, and that is investigative journalism in a way. And then the kind of more kind of like the other side of, if you're on an investigations team, your whole job is just to try and find new things that aren't already in the public domain. And that's how I would probably sum it up.
Awesome. Well, don't go digging around about us.
I'll try not to.
That sounds awesome. I just wanted to, you mentioned in your elevator pitch summary that you worked in the visual storytelling team.
Yeah.
I don't know what that is, what that means. Do you want to give us a bit of a description of what it is?
Yes. I didn't know what it was until I joined the team. We're a new team at the FT, and our job is essentially to tell interesting stories, whether they are features, could be investigations, explainers, and just they have to have an interesting visual element. So as newspaper journalism has become more and more digital, there's so much more that you can do with with the tools and digital kind of tools at your disposal. So it could be having kind of 3D moving images to accompany the text, or maps that move as you scroll down the story, stories that should be told with visual elements as well as the text. And my job on that team is just the kind of being a reporter, as it would be on any other kind of team. I kind of do the interviewing people, research and things like that, writing up the actual the copy, which is what journalists call the text, basically. And then other people on the team, and I can contribute ideas to how we might tell it visually and things. But then there's really skilled people on the team, like developers, who will actually build the interesting digital assets that go with the story.
Okay,
sounds very cutting edge.
I think it's quite interesting that it's quite common in American media, like the New York Times and Wall Street Journal do a lot of stuff like that, and some British newspapers were doing it kind of but maybe 5 to 8 years ago or something, but it's not so common in British newspapers now, and I think it's just a funding thing probably, and so it's a big drive at the FT to kind of do these sort of interesting stories and try and give our subscribers as much value for money as they.
Yeah, absolutely. I think particularly because with the way mainstream television and things like that are going into more like subscription models and stuff, there's probably that drive to try and retain more young viewers and readers as well. So I guess that could be like a way of retaining that sort of demographic.
Yeah, exactly, 100%. And I think somewhere like the Financial Times, obviously, when you think of that newspaper, you probably think of a certain type of demographic who would read it.
Yeah.
I think it's very much trying to appeal to a lot more people and is starting to succeed. I think the fact that I'm working there is a big sign of that. 16-year-old me would have not believed it if you told me that I was going to work at the Financial Times. But they are appealing a lot more to female readers and I think to younger readers. Awesome. But that's definitely part of it. Yeah, I think so.
Brilliant. And you alluded to it there in your previous answer, but what does it actually look like day to day then for you working at the FT?
So I guess how I would describe my day to day, I love having a daily routine, and I
does it start with a coffee?
It doesn't.
It doesn't.
I'm not a coffee drinker. I think I'd be bouncing off the walls if I drank coffee. It starts with a big breakfast.
Yeah. I remember watching the.
I'm letting the side down, aren't I?
No, absolutely not. Actually, I think now if you're not a coffee drinker, you're like, more on the niche side. I remember watching The Wire. I don't know if any of you guys watched it, but there was that series where it was about the newspaper and the journalists, and they're all like, it was like the classic very male dominant sort of floor. They're all outside smoking, drinking their like big mugs of coffee. I think that's probably like how that's painted in our minds, stereotypically, but it's nice to know that, it's not always like that.
Most people in newsrooms do drink coffee. I'm probably in the minority.
Long days. So sorry to interrupt. Go ahead.
And just to pick up on that, I think you've actually raised a really good point, and it's a big purpose as to why we're doing this podcast, to show that a lot of our preconceptions about industries aren't actually what they may appear to be. So it's great that you can bring to light the fact that it is a lot more diverse in the journalism industry, and people aren't just smoking in schoolrooms, coming up with stories together.
Yeah.
I mean, I still think journalism isn't as diverse as it should be, but it's hopefully moving in the right direction, however slowly it is. What were we talking about?
Your day-to-day.
Day-to-day, of course. So not a coffee, an Earl Grey tea.
Earl Grey tea.
With oat milk. But yeah, so I kind of start by, I'm always trying to learn something new. So I'm currently learning to code in a language called R, because coding is really useful for investigative journalism, for gathering data and trying to essentially for gathering data to tell stories from. And I learnt to code in a language called Python in my old job. Which was very useful at that organisation, but most newsrooms use R. So I'm now learning that. So I
sorry to cut you off there. Is that something that is becoming more of like a requirement, a skill for people to have going into journalism or developing in journalism, or is that something more of a personal interest? It's
not a requirement, but I would recommend it to anyone who wants to do original kind of investigative style journalism and find stories. I think another reason I wanted to learn it is because journalism is a lot of soft skills. It's people skills, it's talking to people, it's making contacts. And I kind of, for my own kind of feeling of worth, wanted to have some tangible skills, like some more hard skills as well. But so I did a master's in journalism. In investigative journalism specifically, but all of the different types of journalism masters you could do, a lot of them these days would teach you to code, or at least recommend that you learn to code, because not only is it good for gathering data, which is like going on the internet, and it's called scraping, and it's basically going on the internet, and if there's lots of documents on there that you want to analyze all of them, you can use coding to download all of them in one fell swoop and then analyze all of them so instead of like on the movies,
it's so much more efficient.
Yeah, like on the movies, the President's Men or Spotlight or something, they're probably sitting there, going through, trawling through document after document after document. And this is like the modern way of doing it, essentially. Okay. And so I would really recommend learning it. And not only is it good for that side of journalism, but also with digital being the main form of newspaper journalism now, it's another way. It's the way you build charts and maps and all the kind of interesting visual sides that go with the story. There's lots of other languages, not just R, but like JavaScript and all sorts that they use. So I think any young person going into journalism now, if you have that, then you will be really well received. And awesome. I would personally recommend it 100%.
Brilliant. So just, sorry, to go back to to Alex's question, and I rudely interrupted. So your day-to-day starts with a big breakfast, Earl Grey tea with oat milk, and then, you get into to the investigations. How does that sort of look?
Yeah, so I kind of, as I said, I start with a bit of half an hour of trying to learn something new, at the moment coding, and then I always try and spend my first hour or two of the day try is a big word, but the aim is to spend the first hour or two looking into new stories, like new leads that you might have, or new ideas that you've had. So you were reading the news yesterday morning and you saw something and you thought, that story that's in the US, we could do something similar in the UK, or like, this is an unanswered question in this article. And so you always have like a long list of those kind of story ideas. And if you're never setting aside time to try and develop them, then you don't have anything to hit the ground running with when your next story is after your next story is published, if that makes sense. Okay. So I always try and spend the first hour looking into those new ideas, just seeing if anyone else has already covered it, because if they have, then that's out the window. That's not an idea anymore. Like just a quick kind of bit of looking into that, and then the rest of the day is working on the current story that you're working on, that you're going to publish in the next few weeks or whatever. And that day to day would see me emailing lots of people asking for interviews. In the line of work I'm doing, which is kind of features and investigations, it's mainly speaking to kind of professors, academics, researchers. Obviously in the police, it was talking to police officers, women who'd been abused by police officers, because they were my sources for those stories, interviewing those people for their stories, or if they're an academic or researcher, for their take on the story, or on the topic. So trying to find people like that, interviewing them. Research, just reading all around that subject. And also I do a lot of submitting freedom of information requests, which is basically you can ask any public body for information that they might hold on a certain topic. And that's a really good way of getting stories, because it's not publicly out there, and if you ask for it and they give it to you, it's yours. And sometimes they publish it on their website, so if you get it, you have to move quickly, because it's only exclusively yours for a certain time.
I bet the government was getting bombarded with those during the COVID sort of two-year period, right? For data
absolutely,
and all of this stuff.
On contracts that they were giving out, and for PPE and stuff, I'm sure. And journalists are probably the bane of civil servants' lives in that sense. But no, that's a great way of getting stories. And
how much of your time is spent outside of the office actually interviewing people, and then sort of balanced against the time you spend actually writing as well? Do you strike a good balance? Do you find you do more of one than the other?
I think a good journalists should spend more time interviewing people, researching, than they do writing, because it's like I probably gather like maybe 10 times the amount of material for a story than I actually use, if that makes sense. Like I did a feature recently on e-waste for the FT magazine, and I think I counted that I interviewed something like maybe 20 people for 1,000. How long was the piece? I can't remember. It was maybe 2,000 words. Oh no, something like 2,000 words. And it was like I interviewed like 20 people for it, which is like a lot of time, but it's worth it, because you get such good material and information from all of them. And that's how you get these little nuggets of facts that people don't know, and they like read it and they think, oh my God, wow, I didn't know that. That's so interesting. And that's how you get those things from speaking to experts. But in terms of getting out the office, that's a really interesting question, because kind of 20 years ago, you would need to leave the office to speak to people.
Yeah, well, we live in a new world now.
We live in a new world, and so it's so easy now to talk to people from all over the world, and just set up a video call, and it's almost as good as being in person with them. I'm not saying it's a replacement, but in the kind of job I'm doing at the moment, which is kind of features, and if we do anything investigative, it's kind of coming from this is an interesting question, let's try and answer it. Whereas if you're a beat reporter, you are like an expert on that beat. So at the FT, there are beat reporters who say cover like private equity, or they cover the legal profession, or they cover like the accountancy firms, or stuff like that. Their job is to know everything about that beat, and so they can be kind of coming up with really like niche questions, and they would be going out a lot more, I think, for lunches and actual in-person coffees and things like that, because they're trying to get people to tell them stuff that they wouldn't like tell them exclusive things, potentially off the record, which is when you don't tell someone that it's coming from you. They're trying to get really important information, and you need to build up trust with your sources to do that, and the best way of doing that is to meet them in person and go for lunches. So I think we need to be careful as a profession that we don't only move to speaking to people virtually, because you would lose a lot of the opportunity to get really good stories, I think.
And what parts of the job do you enjoy the most then? What do you find most satisfying? Is it publishing a story? Is it interviewing like individuals, or is it the actual writing aspect of it? What do you enjoy most?
All of it, I would say. But
passionate. That's what we love to see.
I interviewed a climate scientist the other day, and the interview was, I kind of set aside 45 minutes for it, and we ended up speaking for like an hour and 10 minutes because it was so fascinating, and everything he said was so interesting, and I kept coming up with new questions because on the back of what he'd been saying, and it's just so interesting. And so I really love that part. I love writing it up, because writing is kind of the main reason I initially became interested in journalism when I was at school. But I think the main thing I love about it is it's also really exciting when you publish it, and that's just a great feeling, like seeing your byline on the story, and seeing people tweet about it, and that's just that's such a great feeling. But I think the most exciting thing, and this is the reason that I became interested in investigations, is trying to have impact from your work and seeing it have an impact in the real world, which you don't always see. But the investigations I was doing on domestic abuse by police officers, the kind of what we were looking at was the main thing I was looking at was how police forces respond when a woman reports a police officer partner for domestic abuse. And a lot of the time they just ignore it, they push it under the carpet, they don't investigate it properly. And there was obviously a myriad of explanations you could put to that. But that, after kind of a series of articles on that, some lawyers launched a nationwide super complaint, which is basically a legal mechanism for complaining about institutional issues within police forces, and the police regulators are looking into it now. We don't know what they'll find or what recommendations they'll make, or if they will agree that there's a problem and that it might lead to nothing. But the fact that it's caused people to be having to undertake that work and making police forces do that work and investigate it as a problem is really that's kind of the reason you do it.
I guess it's shone the light on what's going on, and behind the scenes as well, and it sort of sparked this snowball effect of other people getting involved in where the impact comes from. Yeah,
exactly. And I also think I think sometimes the society has to be kind of ripe for something to happen, and so it was just quite interesting that I kind of started reporting on that topic. I can't remember now, maybe 3 years ago, and then like a year later, just various other things were happening, and then obviously last year, the obviously tragic death of Sarah Everard, and various other things that kind of happened, and there was just more and more criticism of the Met, and it kind of brought all of those stories back into the limelight, and now there's kind of like in the news every week, the Met's in the news, and all the police are in the news, and it kind of, and in a similar way, like the Me Too movement, just various stories all happened at the same time, and it was like Harvey Weinstein, the FT did the President's Club scandal, and it's almost like the society has to be, sometimes a story that would have a massive impact one year wouldn't have had the same impact 5 years earlier because society
different
wasn't ready
context,
for it,
right?
or different context. Yeah, it's just really interesting.
No, I think what you raise about impact there is really interesting, because I'm sure Nikki would agree, as much as we enjoy our work, it's not necessarily always the case that we have such a positive impact on society. And I just want to note that Alex is being very modest here, because this same story, which has obviously had a huge impact on society, actually led to you winning an award. Am I right?
It did, yes. Yeah.
And that I think is testament to your brilliant work and the impact that you're having on society through your actions. So
brilliant.
Well done for that.
One thing I would say on the kind of impact thing is, it's quite interesting that you say, we're not having a positive impact in the same way. I think something I've learned as I've got older, kind of from a teenager to a more kind of nuanced adult, is that actually people have impact in such different ways, and is not necessarily, that story was the kind of rare example of one where you do some work and then you see the direct result happening. But that isn't normally the case. And in the work I'm kind of doing at the moment, I wrote that feature on e-waste like last week, and it wasn't like it suddenly led to all of the companies who produce the products I was writing about saying, we're going to completely change our designs and start recycling everything. And I think actually, everyone in society has a different really important role. And I remember being at uni and a friend talking about a friend who loved theatre at school and was now training to be an accountant, and another friend kind of got a bit sniffy and was like, why is she going to be an accountant? That's so corporate and boring. And I was like, well, theatres need accountants, and do you know what I mean? Everyone needs
that's like the classic thing of you hear the sort of like speeches people make, and they say, if you're in like a circle where people sort of constantly question, like, why are you doing that? Don't do that. And I think it's a bit of a lesson for our listeners as well, especially if they're a bit younger. If that's the case and you're passionate about something, or you really enjoy doing something, don't listen to those people. Yeah, you potentially need to change your circle as well, because if they're not actually encouraging you and throwing a bit more fuel on your fire as opposed to something else, you need to consider that.
100%.
Exactly. And I kind of think a job exists because
society
needs it, and there's a demand for it, and and some I kind of also think when we were cavemen or whatever, this is going back a long way, but everyone had a role, and I don't know if this is scientifically proven or not, but society tends to generally assume, so I will too, that the men were hunters and the women were nest builders and they're looking after the kids at home. Everyone had their role, and then we moved to like an agrarian society, and you had the farmers doing the farming, and then you had people doing the cooking, and then more and more we kind of specialised, and then you had doctors who were taking care of making people healthy, and you had the farmers still growing the food, and we're just specialised even more highly now.
Have you read *Sapiens*?
I haven't.
You haven't?
I haven't, but I really want to. It's on my list.
It's literally, so when
I can't wait to read it. I love books like that.
Honestly, it's such a good book. I talked a little bit about it on another episode where I was interviewed. It's a book that I would recommend, and talks a lot on this subject, the kind of chronological steps of our evolution. Not necessarily all factually proven, but theories as well. So, so just to kind of summarize, so your day-to-day, you do a lot of research, you get out of the office, you do interviews, spend a lot of time writing. Do you work a lot in teams, or is it quite an isolated job? How does that work? Because you say you did a bit of coding as well. So do you have to sort of do that on the side to build your own script to do the data analysis, or do you have people that do that for you?
It's a good question.
I think it'd just be good for people to understand, like, when they go in, are they just like, boom, they have to crack on and learn all this stuff, or do they have quite a good support network?
Generally, I think it depends on the organisation. I think it really depends on the organisation. So my old place, the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, it was very small. But when I said I wanted to learn to code, they had one kind of coding expert there, and he was absolutely lovely, and he kind of mentored me. And so I would go away, and he told me, okay, this is a good source for you to learn from. And I would go away and learn. But when I got stuck, he would then help me. Mm-hmm. And it's a similar case at the FT, like with me trying to learn R, but people are very supportive supportive. Like, I just go away and try it, and then if I get stuck, I ask questions.
Yeah.
But in terms of working in a team, I usually always have been working in a team, because investigations that's the kind of nature of it. But then the police domestic abuse stuff was more kind of solo, but in a team, in the sense that I had an editor really helping me and guide me.
Yeah.
And it's kind of a mixture of team stuff at the FT and me going away and doing the reporting, but it needs a team to make it into a really cool visual story.
The teamwork makes the dream work.
Yeah, exactly.
Before we move on to sort of a different phase of your life, I just had a very quick question. I think, again, speaking about the stereotypes of journalism and what it's like to work at like a newspaper or something, what's the dynamic like? What's the working environment like? You see these images of editors screaming at journalists, find a story, and it's very kind of animated. What's the reality for our listeners, if they're thinking, oh my God, I'm going to go in, it's going to be really intense, really, busy environment and stuff. How does that look? I don't know if you wanted to add to that question, Anna.
No, I think it's a really interesting one. And yeah, I'd be really interested in hearing your answer.
I get, again, a boring answer, but it really depends on the organisation, I think. I've never worked in a tabloid, but I get the impression that it's a bit more like that in the kind of tabloid environment. I think it depends on the place you work, basically. And there are also broadsheets, which is the other type of newspaper generally, like that I've heard have a lot more of a kind of traditional hierarchical kind of culture, and the editor coming out and shouting and stuff like that. And I used to do quite a lot of freelancing at the BBC. And it was really nice, but it was quite a lot of pressure because it was breaking news. And so people would sometimes talk quite curtly to each other and because they were under stress.
Right.
But I haven't seen that at the FT. I think it's very collegiate is the word that everyone tends to use about it. And it's true, like everyone's very collaborative, and it's quite like an academic kind of atmosphere in there. Like people are just very, got their heads down.
Focused.
Yeah, focused, but everyone's really friendly and willing to help each other and share stories.
Presumably you get some people who had other careers and then went into journalism, like in terms of the specialist areas, or is it everyone's a trained journalist? Because I was just thinking in terms of, say, private equity, maybe some of those journalists might have had private equity experience or at least worked at a fund.
I think more so at the FT, probably. I think there's quite a lot of people who probably were working in finance or in business or something else, and then have moved, and they didn't really need training as a journalist because they had this other specialist knowledge that they would learn quickly how to report, on the job. I think it's a mixture, I would say.
Yeah. No, that's cool.
And just wrapping up on what you actually do. So go back 10 years. What would your key tips be to yourself before embarking on a career in journalism?
Oh, that's a good question. So what are tips from me now to me aged?
Exactly.
Teenaged. I would say work hard. Try and get as much work experience as you can, which I always feel a bit conflicted giving that advice, because it was easy for me because I grew up near London and my parents could luckily afford to pay for me to get a train into London for 5 days. And obviously it's all unpaid a lot of the time. And so I think it's quite unfair to say that if somebody lives up north and can't afford to come down to London or doesn't have anyone to stay with. I would say potentially there's more opportunities now after COVID for kind of virtual internships, which is not nearly as you won't learn as much, but it's something at least to aim for, I think. And other things you can aim for as well are like you can try and write your own blog or do stuff just to show that you're passionate about journalism without having to go and get the start a podcast. But another tip I would also give is that like what you write on the internet will probably always be on the internet, and it's like age 15, you probably have very different ideas of,
Don't look at my Facebook from back in the day. Geez, we're all a bit cringed out by that.
Exactly.
So just to quickly ask you then, because even when I was trying to become a solicitor myself, everyone said, oh, you need work experience and, that kind of stuff. I tried to go and get work experience, but no, we want you to have experience in order to give you some experience is the classic tale. So for someone that's thinking about doing journalism, do you have any practical steps or advice you can give them to take practical steps in order to be able to find some unpaid work experience, whether it's tapping into their network or maybe reaching out or using some kind of charity or something. Do you have any tips on that?
I would say all of those things. I would say there are, firstly, Google, just all the places, big newspapers, small publications. A lot of the time, with the internet, there are so many online magazines that can't afford to pay people to write a lot. So they would take writing from you. And that's what I mean by kind of virtual work experience as well, like emailing small publications that do really niche things online and saying, can I write for you, and just showing that passion. And in terms of bigger organisations trying to get in there for work experience, sometimes you have to apply, and it's true what you say about needing work experience to apply, which is annoying. But I also think a lot of journalists love pesky people, because you need to be a pesky person to be a good journalist.
Yep.
And so if you find it, you can dig around usually and find the names of the editors or of a certain section, or just on LinkedIn and stuff. Or
I think that's really applicable to any kind of job or career. I mean, I did that. I know I had to do that. So, you kind of have to go in and sort of leave a bit of your pride at the door and just say, right, I'm going to find people. I'm just going to take a punt, go on LinkedIn, put my best foot forward and just ask.
And the worst thing that can happen is that they say no, but at least then
or ghost you.
Exactly.
But either way, at least you tried.
But what I was going to say is, if they ghost you, email them again. And if they ghost you again, email them again. And
it's the follow-up, right? It's always in the follow-up.
There's a fine line between being a stalker and being keen. But
do not harass anyone, okay? Don't take that out of context.
End your career before it started.
I would say email 3 times with a couple of weeks in between.
Good advice.
Space, and then if they're the kind of person who's impressed by it, they will notice it after the 3rd email and reply. And that's what they did a lot.
Right?
They will be impressed and be like, she or he is keen.
Yeah.
But also, so I did that as that was just the way that I got some of my work experiences. I would also admit that I did have a couple of, my mum was a physio, and she treated some patients who knew some journalists and would just ask. And I was very lucky to get that. And a teacher at my school had a brother who was an editor at the Independent, and he set me up some work experience. And I'm very lucky, and because a lot of people wouldn't have had those networks. And I think, but if you don't, then I think just focusing on the other way, which is Googling it, emailing people, cold calling.
And I think the point you made about starting your own blog is a really good one, because if you are emailing, it'd be great to have an example of, look, here's what I do, here's what I'm trying to do, and I'd love to come and work at your organisation. I think that would be quite a sensible strategy for someone that doesn't have those connections.
Exactly, it just shows that you're keen. Yeah.
So just moving on to your actual background then, could you briefly describe what your parents do? You mentioned your mum was a physio. What does your dad do? We just want to give the listeners a kind of an insight into what you were growing up and where you come from.
Yeah, so my mum is a physio. My dad is a construction manager. So he trained as a quantity surveyor, basically count the number of bricks in the buildings and all that kind of thing, and then was managing big construction projects. And I grew up in the Hertfordshire countryside. Was
that private or state, with social, economic and educational background? I think would be quite interesting.
Absolutely. It was a state school, comprehensive. It was a good state school. So I can't exactly claim that I went to a really tough school. It was a really good state school, and it was a girls' school, which is very I feel had a big impact on me in good and bad ways. I would definitely say my family, I would describe myself as privileged. I would say my parents could afford to, take us on nice holidays and go to museums and buy books. And those things seem small, but those are the kind of things that develop your interest and curiosity in the world that drives you towards a job like journalism. And my mum would read with me. They weren't, the other thing I would also say is I was lucky that my parents were around. And so my mum would read with me a lot. And that's probably where my love of reading came from. And I would definitely say I had a lucky upbringing.
And were there any kind of key principles you learnt growing up that you think have stood you in good stead for your career now?
I would say, my family are quite civic-minded. My dad was always very passionate about the environment and climate change. So I kind of picked up my interest in that kind of sphere from him. And he was always the kind of person to be involved in the local like committees and things like that. And I think they brought me up to be very curious and interested in the society around me. And I think that's I would describe it as being civic minded. Yeah,
that's really awesome. Yeah, so they kind of had that impact on you by giving you a bit more of maybe an understanding and interest in the social side of life and things like that.
Yeah.
Did they sort of during your upbringing? Did they how did they deal with sort of encouraging you to maybe go to university, potentially helping you decide in what kind of career you wanted to go into? Because you have sort of one side where the parents want their kids to be, doctors, lawyers, accountants, and you have another side where it's a bit more free. Do what you're passionate about, find what you love, and then you've got the little bit in the middle where it's a bit of both. How did they impact you and guide you in deciding those things?
That's a really good question. I think they didn't really dictate much at all. My mum just always said to me, Alex, the most important thing is to do something you're passionate about and that you enjoy. And she loves her job as a physio so much. She loves talking to people, and she's kind of like their counsellor, almost. Like they come and lie on
like
her
a hairdresser,
couch,
isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, and like her putty in her hands. But it was very much like, do what you're passionate about. And they were very encouraging and kind of said, Alex, you can do anything. You're so lucky to be able to do anything. Make sure you do something you enjoy. And there was never like a focus on you need to go and earn lots of money or anything. I think when I was 14 and I said I wanted to be a fashion designer, Mum was like, might be a bit of a waste, which is quite interesting that she said that, because but that's the only time I ever remember her saying, having an opinion on something I said. And for a while I went through phases of wanting to do lots of different things. But journalism was always something that I
Did you try those different things as well?
I did actually
dip a toe?
I did some work experience at a law firm, actually.
All right.
I can't remember what it was called, but I was in the construction law department.
Okay.
I think my dad had sorted it for me through a construction contact, and I'm not going to lie, it wasn't my cup of tea.
Then tell us.
Construction law,
Yeah.
but I think other types of law I would have found really interesting. I did think about becoming an environmental lawyer, actually. I was just always interested in journalism. And I remember at school, if we got I loved English, and if we got an assignment that was to write a newspaper column for homework, I just loved that homework and would spend 3 hours on it and trying to come up with funny stuff for my column. And I was super keen.
So you had quite a passion for writing and
I love writing stories for my doll's house dolls, and I would write out the stories of their lives, and
Did you ever play Sims?
A very cool teenager. Yeah. What did you say?
Did you ever play Sims at all?
Of course I play Sims.
I can see that.
A lot.
That's really interesting. I think our viewers would benefit from understanding your actual moves from education to where you are now. Did that involve university? Did it involve a master's? I think you mentioned a master's before, but what was your degree in?
Particularly for people who are considering going into journalism, let's say they're doing their A-levels at the moment and they're looking to apply. Do you want to talk us through that journey?
Yeah. Absolutely. I went to uni, and actually going back to the question about my parents, it was kind of always assumed that I would go to uni, and I did go to, as I said, went to a good state school, and I would say so a lot of people did leave at 16 and didn't go to uni, but once you got into sixth form, it was kind of assumed that you would apply to uni, and only a few people didn't.
Right.
So I went to uni. I did politics and French. Another big tip I would say is get involved in student media. That's a huge thing if you want to be a journalist. If you don't, it's kind of people will doubt your interest.
So what is that exactly?
The student newspaper or the student TV channel and student radio. I did all three, actually.
Oh, wow.
A bit keen.
Do you know what? I don't think at my school we even...
at uni.
Oh, at uni. At uni.
Yeah,
Sorry. Okay.
My school didn't have anything like that. I think I went through a phase of trying to set one up and gave up quite quickly.
I think someone tried to set up a little newspaper thing, but it
didn't. Mine didn't take off. I think so. Join a student paper, and then it's a really interesting question what you do next, because you can. It depends on what type of journalism you want to do. The old route was go and join get a job at a local paper, learn on the job at the local paper, and then after a few years there, apply to a national. and unfortunately that route just doesn't exist so much anymore. There are still good local newspapers, but they're few and far between, and they have hardly any money, and so that's not the way that people tend to train now. So if you can afford to do it, in terms of like, you can get a student loan for a master's as well, which is what I did, but it will only cover either your living or your fees. So you have to either, you know, like be helped by family, or unfortunately, or have saved for like 2 years before to cover the other half of it. To do a master's in journalism, which is what I did, and I'm not gonna lie, it really, really helped me. And
it's very competitive as well, isn't it, journalism?
But journalism is very competitive.
So far as I've heard, so you almost have to do a master's, right?
I don't think you have to. I think if you've been doing loads of work experience. So I was actually freelancing for the BBC throughout my undergraduate, just as a result of all the work experience and just asking for opportunities and stuff. And I think I had kind of had my foot in the door at the BBC because of that. And so I think I nearly didn't do the master's, and I was just going to badger away at the BBC. But I decided I wanted to do like investigations and a certain type of journalism, and that's why I then went away and did the master's, because various people did advise me, like, if you can, it will really help you.
You kind of specialise.
And just like train you to be a journalist in the way that in the way that you used to would have learned on a local paper or like through a national paper grad scheme. But there aren't as many places now because journalism doesn't have as much money as it used to.
Right.
So it's almost like you're paying to train yourself, unfortunately.
And are there any like grants or funding available for, say, someone that couldn't have the parental help?
There are. There are at each of the universities that do journalism postgrads. There are grants, but there's not nearly enough. Like when I did it, there were like 3 scholarship students on my course of 30 investigative journalism students, but the wider year group, which was doing all the other types of journalism course like broadcast and newspaper, I don't think they're that many. Okay. I think those 3 might have been all of them, actually. I don't know, but but basically there are ways if you can't do that, and you just got to plug away at the work experience, the writing, and just work experience is everything, I would say.
So you went to university, politics and French. Was that with a year in
Paris?
Paris,
yeah.
Worked at the BBC, did your masters.
Yeah.
Along the way, were there any kind of key mentors or influences who helped guide you in your career, and what role did they play?
That's a really good question. I would say my auntie has been a big mentor. She's not a journalist.
Shout out, auntie.
In terms of mentors, I would say, I think once... I'm trying to think of who I had as a mentor before. I could talk about at the bureau.
Did you have anyone at school, any particular teachers that maybe helped guide you, particularly in your A-level years?
Yeah.
Helping you with, you know...
Yeah, I had an English teacher who I absolutely loved called Miss Frank, and I don't know if she'll be listening to this, but she, I've mentioned that I loved English, and she always really encouraged me, and just got excited about stuff I wrote, and that was really lovely. And I had various really memorable teachers that made a big impact on me. And then one teacher who, when I said that I wanted to be, he was a drama teacher, and when I said I wanted to be a journalist, he was the one who said, my brother's or my sister's husband is the arts editor at the Independent. I'll sort you out some work experience. So they were big role models. And then once I was at the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, which is where I was before the FT, I had an amazing boss called Myrian, and he was previously at the BBC for a long time and was the journalist who basically with someone else kind of uncovered the whole Jimmy Savile scandal. Wow. And is just like an amazing journalist. And he was like my work dad, and he just really encouraged me with all those police stories, and just was always giving me tips, taking me aside for 2 minutes to give me tips and advice and setting me up with contacts for other jobs, and he was just amazing.
And are you involved in mentoring in any capacity as well?
I was when I was at the bureau. So I was mentoring 3 people because I think it's really important to give back. The only reason I haven't for the last 6 months is just because I've been new in my job, so I thought I'll give myself a break. But I'm planning to start again soon. I just think it's really important to I recognise that I've come from a fairly privileged background, and I want to like help people who haven't. And I did some tutoring for a volunteer kind of tutoring charity as well. But I think I'm going to focus more on mentoring, because I think it's I feel like that's more helpful.
That's amazing. I think mentoring, particularly for us, is quite close to our hearts as well. You know, I think even sat around this table, we'll have quite different backgrounds. And, you know, even though you're really honest about the fact that you believe you had a privileged background, thank you for being so honest. We really appreciate it. I came from a less privileged background myself. You know, Alex had a pretty humble background himself. And
I wouldn't describe it as such.
You know, you had incredible parents that really supported you. So, you know, it's just amazing to it's just an amazing feeling to pay it forward, but also help other young people to kind of, you know, get ahead in life if they haven't had some of the opportunities.
Absolutely. And I think this conversation will be helpful to a young aspiring journalist out there. So thank you again for being so open and honest about your experiences. Just to wrap up.
Well, just before we do that, I think, a lot of the learning and growth is in mistakes we make, or, you know, some challenges we face. So can you think of say, you know, maybe 2 or 3 key sort of major like challenges you face in your life? You don't have to get too personal, professionally or personally, where you feel like, you know, that it was a springboard to a next level of growth and development in your life?
That's a really good question. I can't think of a specific moment, but one thing that I think I kind of like came across was when I went from a girls' school to a mixed uni, obviously. I found it quite being in lectures with guys, I found quite a shock to the system.
Okay. Like,
I know it sounds really weird, but I would look at them and they would just say, I'm not painting you with the same brush, but they would say stuff with such confidence. And especially because I was studying politics, it was very like kind of high-minded political stuff. And they would say it with such confidence and have these highfalutin opinions. And I would just sit there thinking, you're so much cleverer than me, and just kind of just felt so in superior, if that's is that word inferior that's the word. And I would just like, it really kind of shook me a bit, and I would think they're all cleverer than me. And then the same when I went into working as well, like I would think that all of the guys that I was working with who are similar age to me were just naturally clever, just because they came across so much more kind of self-assured and confident. And I think I'm the kind of person who comes across like always asking questions, always seeming like, oh, I'm not, not sure about this, like what about this?
So how did you overcome that?
I think just time has been like, I genuinely think just finding myself and just doing okay in my career and realizing, oh, I can do this. And also I think talking to other friends about it and my boyfriend about it, who isn't a guy like that, or maybe to other people he would seem really confident. He does probably seem like really confident and sure of himself, and just talking to him and kind of realizing that actually everyone's got kind of things in their minds and they might seem really
and different things to offer as well.
Different things to offer.
I think even now, last year I went through a period of like low confidence in my job, and I was looking around thinking, oh my God, can I do this? Everyone around me is so much smarter. But you just have to be a bit more introspective and think about it and really just
absolutely
remember what why you're doing what you're doing as well.
And I think imposter syndrome, what you've described,
100%.
is so common, especially when you're starting in a new environment. It's kind of part of the process, and the more you overcome that challenge, I guess the easier it becomes on the next challenge, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And someone once said to me, don't compare your insides with other people's outsides, and I think that is just such good advice. Like I'm always got these self-doubt and like questions like, am I doing enough, am I this, I'm an imposter, blah 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 in my head. And the top bosses probably are feeling under pressure, doubting themselves in some ways, and don't compare. And I probably come across confident, but inside I'm like,
particularly in the social media era that we're living in through now, where it's all highlight reels and we're just comparing our lives and ourselves to other people's lives, and we think it's all glossy and fabulous, and you don't know what's going on the inside. So with that, Alex, I think you were going to move to some conclusionary points. Do you want to take us through that?
Yeah, no. So firstly, thank you for being so open and honest again.
Thank you so much.
What we like to do on this podcast is also share with our guests some of the books or podcasts that have particular influence on our interviewees, and it would just be really interesting to hear like what books have been particularly profound to you and why as well.
That's a really good question. There would be a lot, and like trying to think of them all off the top of my head would be difficult, but British by F. Hirsch have been really kind of so informative for me, and just I think everyone should read them. And just in terms of privilege and what we can do about helping make our workplaces and just general lives and society more welcoming to all people of all backgrounds. And also more recently I've read a book called The Unexpected Joy of the Ordinary by Catherine Gray. And my friend recommended it, and she's always recommending amazing books, and so inspiring. And some bits are a little cheesy, but overall the kind of message is just love ordinary things in life and living in the moment. And I would say it's quite nice reading that book because I would say I'm quite good at that anyway. Like I am the type of person who every morning when I'm cycling across London Bridge, I look at the Tower Bridge and the river and I'm like, oh my God, it's amazing. Like the river's amazing. London's so beautiful.
Do you know what? I used to motorbike to work in Old Street when I worked in the city, and I used to just ride through and just look around. I used to ride through, Hyde Park Corner, down Constitution Hill, on the Mall, past Buckingham Palace, then along the Embankment, Big Ben, and I'm like, Jesus, I'm so lucky. I get to see this every single day.
People travel thousands of miles
just to see Big Ben from the US or Asia or wherever they're from, and we just see it every day. So I think we can definitely take little things like that for granted day to day. So just as the film says, look up, not don't look down. Don't look up. Look
exactly.
up. Look around you and just appreciate those
pretty clouds, daffodils coming out, like small moments in life, and like hot chocolate at the end of a hard day. And we kind of in films they're always telling you to like aim for these insane experiences, and especially social media like Insta is just like really pushing that kind of vibe. And actually it's just being happy and content every day, and also being content rather than chasing like happiness. I think it's like really important. But that book is really good, and I would recommend it to anyone.
Awesome. Thanks very much, Alex. So I mean, just a couple of points I wanted to mention before we close off, some key takeaways. I think obviously for anyone listening, I hope you've enjoyed listening to Alex's story. I certainly have. I think we could have probably talked for another hour because there's some really interesting topics. But ask yourself why. Why are you going into this? Does this sound something that's of interest to you? Do you like writing? Do you like speaking to people? Are you going to feel motivated to go out there and do a bit of pestering of people to get opportunities? Because you're really going to have to do that. Although you mentioned, you were fortunate to have the family contacts and ways of getting in, but contacts, super important. Build your network, work on your communication skills, because that's one of the key skills as well that you'll need. I mean, I've just put it in capital letters on my page here, relationships. And this is going to be like a recurring theme, I think, on the podcast with Alex, but build your relationships, start early, and just tell people what you're interested in. You never know when someone will say, oh, I know somebody that does something similar, or you might be able to speak to. Alex, do you want to add to any of that?
No, I completely concur with all of that. And one of the key things I pulled out from this discussion was the fact that you're doing you're doing fantastically in your career and doing well writing, but yet you still continue to learn coding. Although people might not think that's a massive part of journalism, you see its use, and you're setting aside the time each day to make sure that you're on top of it and essentially going to be a journalist of the future. So I think our listeners could learn something from that, in that doing more can get you more in the longer run.
And it goes back to, even the topic of our podcast, you can be as skilled at writing naturally skilled as you want, but unless you put in the hard work in addition to that, to do the things we've discussed and that Alex has spoken about, it's going to be a lot harder to build your career. So, so thank you very much for joining us, Alex. We really appreciate you taking the time to be with us.
Very nice of you to invite me on.
Thank you for everyone, whoever is listening. Thank you for listening. We appreciate your time as well. Follow us on Instagram, YouTube, subscribe, all that good stuff. We'll catch you on the next one. Thanks.